What happens when a lifelong friend of the king suddenly breaks his silence and turns against him? It's a question that has shaken not only the British establishment but also observers around the world. For over 6 decades, Nicholas Winston SS, a descendant of one of Britain's most revered statesmen, Sir Winston Churchill, has remained a steadfast confidant and vocal ally of King Charles III. Through personal upheavals, political storms, and royal controversies, Nicholas SS stood in quiet solidarity with the man he once referred to as my brother in everything but blood. But now, in a moment that feels less like a political reckoning and more like a personal betrayal, that alliance has fractured, and publicly. The headlines are clear. Nicholas Winston SS has spoken out against the monarch he has supported for most of his life. What's more, he has done so with a tone of unmistakable finality. No vague remarks. No veiled diplomacy. His criticism is direct, deliberate, and layered with historical grievances long buried under the glittering surface of royal pageantry. The royal institution has weathered many storms, scandals, divorces, political overreach, but when the criticism comes from one of its own, from a voice rooted in establishment loyalty, it's more than news. It's a seismic crack in the monarchy's foundation. To fully understand the weight of Nicholas SS' words, one must first appreciate who he is, not merely as a political figure or Churchill's grandson, but as a man whose life and career have been intertwined with the fate of the monarchy itself. Nicholas SS was not born into irrelevance. He was born into expectation. From a young age, he was groomed in the traditions of governance and diplomacy, expected to carry forward the Churchillian legacy not with war speeches or bulldog defiance, but with quiet influence and strategic alliances. His education at Eton, followed by academic accolades from Oxford, set him up not for celebrity but for gravitas. By the time Charles ascended the public stage as the Prince of Wales, Nicholas SS was already within his orbit. Their friendship, forged in private boarding rooms and elite hunting circles, evolved into something deeper, a mentorship of sorts. Nicholas had political instincts. Charles had royal obligations. Together, they navigated decades of transition, including the shifting societal views of the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. And then came Diana, the fairy tale that turned into a cautionary tale. The marriage between Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer wasn't just fodder for tabloids. It was a collision between tradition and emotion, between duty and public affection. Nicholas SS, at the time, emerged as one of the few public figures willing to defend Charles. He called out what he perceived as the media's obsession with Diana's vulnerability, describing it in 1995 as a dangerous exploitation of a woman's pain in order to demonize the future king. Those remarks were controversial then, and they are controversial now, especially in light of the evolving understanding of Diana's suffering, her cries for help, and her eventual demise. For decades, Nicholas SS refused to budge from that position. He was unrepentant. If anything, he doubled down. In his memoir, published in 2008, he wrote, "Loyalty demands fortitude, especially when it's least convenient. I believed then, as I do now, that Charles was a man misunderstood. It was this steadfastness that made his recent remarks all the more jarring. What changed? What broke the unbreakable bond?" This video aims to peel back the layers of that question. We will look closely at Nicholas Winston SS' background, not just his public achievements, but the inner workings of his life that shaped how he sees duty, friendship, and truth. We'll examine his decades-long relationship with King Charles III, including the unspoken tensions and quiet understandings that defined their closeness. We'll revisit the ghost of Princess Diana, not through tabloid recollection but through the lens of historical hindsight and modern perspective. How does one man's view of a woman once dismissed as unstable now become a referendum on royal loyalty? More importantly, we'll dig into what Nicholas SS actually said, his recent statements that ignited a storm across media outlets. These were not the mutterings of an aging aristocrat seeking attention. They were pointed, structured, and deeply personal. He questioned Charles's recent decisions, his moral compass, and even his fitness to lead. And while he did not renounce the monarchy itself, his tone carried a warning that the royal institution can no longer rely on blind loyalty from even its most seasoned allies. Throughout history, the British monarchy has relied on an unspoken covenant with its inner circle: discretion, loyalty, silence. But what happens when one of its oldest defenders breaks that silence? Does it signal a changing tide in how the monarchy is seen, not just by the public, but by those who once helped keep its secrets? And what does that mean for the future of the institution, especially in an era where every gesture is analyzed, every word scrutinized, and every flaw exposed? To answer these questions, we'll venture into rarely explored territories, conversations that took place behind palace walls, letters exchanged in private, off-the-record remarks that now take on new meaning. We'll bring in expert voices, historians, royal biographers, and political analysts to help decode the subtext of Nicholas SS' shift. And we'll ask the uncomfortable but necessary question, was he always wrong about Diana, or has time merely caught up with his conscience? But beyond the facts and figures, this is also a human story. A story of a man who once stood by his friend through hell, only to now say that the friend has lost his way. A story about belief. How it endures, how it breaks, and how it transforms when the truth becomes too heavy to ignore. In many ways, this story mirrors the very challenges the monarchy faces in the 21st century. How to maintain reverence in a world increasingly allergic to secrecy and hierarchy. As the story unfolds, we'll also confront the role of memory in shaping narratives. How does one reconcile years of support for someone who may no longer represent what you believed in? Is Nicholas SS' criticism a betrayal, or is it a necessary correction in the name of integrity? And finally, what does this rupture mean for a public that has long idealized loyalty as the crown jewel of British nobility? We begin this journey not with answers, but with complexity. The kind of complexity that resists easy explanations and dares us to look closer. Nicholas Winston SS has thrown a stone into the still waters of royal tradition. The ripples are just beginning. To understand the gravity of Nicholas Winston SS' recent statements, one must begin with the man himself. Not simply as the grandson of Winston Churchill, though that legacy looms large, but as an individual whose life has been shaped by the weight of history, duty, and proximity to power. Nicholas Winston SS is not a man who emerged from obscurity to make a bold declaration against the throne. His entire life has been defined by a proximity to the very institution he now calls into question. That is what makes his recent words both remarkable and disturbing for those who still believe in the sanctity of the crown. Born in 1949 into one of the most politically distinguished families in modern British history, Nicholas was raised not only with privilege but with purpose. He was the firstborn son of Diana Churchill and Duncan Sandys, a member of Parliament who served as Minister of Defence and was closely tied to post-war Conservative leadership. This lineage placed Nicholas squarely at the intersection of legacy and expectation. From a young age, he was instructed not just in etiquette and tradition, but in statecraft, diplomacy, and the subtle language of influence. His family home was not just a place of leisure, it was a revolving door of global leaders, political thinkers, and royal confidants. It was not uncommon for a young Nicholas to sit quietly at the edge of a conversation between his grandfather Winston and visiting dignitaries, absorbing the language of power like a second tongue. His education was carefully selected and intensely scrutinized. Like many of Britain's upper echelon, Nicholas attended Eton College, where he excelled academically and socially. Though his name alone would have guaranteed status, Nicholas stood out for other reasons. Teachers described him as fiercely inquisitive, disarmingly articulate, and acutely aware of his own position in the grand scheme of British heritage. He was not content to simply carry the Churchill name. He wanted to redefine what it meant. At Eton, he led the Debating Society and founded a student publication focused on international affairs, earning respect and a reputation for having a penetrating mind and a diplomatic touch that belied his years. Oxford followed, where Nicholas studied modern history at Christ Church. His tutors quickly realized that they were not dealing with a student content to recite facts. Nicholas wanted context. He wanted meaning. He dug through archives, interviewed surviving aides to his grandfather, and developed a nuanced understanding of British imperial decline, post-war economic restructuring, and the psychological toll of leadership. While his peers flirted with student protests and ideological experiments, Nicholas maintained a laser focus on legacy. Not just Churchill's, but his own. By the time he graduated, there was no doubt that Nicholas Winston SS would follow a path paved in public service. He began his career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, serving quietly but effectively in postings across Western Europe and Southeast Asia. While he was never a headline name in these roles, those who worked with him observed something uncommon. A man who understood diplomacy not just as negotiation, but as narrative. Nicholas had a gift for seeing how historical memory and public perception could shape the outcome of talks before they even began. This skill would serve him well in the years to come, particularly as he moved from behind-the-scenes diplomacy to a more public-facing political career. In the late 1980s, Nicholas entered Parliament as a Conservative MP, representing a constituency that included both rural nobility and working-class enclaves. Unlike many of his peers who coasted on inherited names, Nicholas earned the loyalty of his constituents through consistent presence and articulate advocacy. He spoke in favor of education reform, criticized short-sighted austerity measures, and gained attention for his nuanced positions on foreign policy. He wasn't interested in ideological purity, he was interested in outcomes. And he believed that Britain, to succeed, must learn to live in the present without dishonoring its past. But even more defining than his political record was his role as a quiet advisor to the royal household. It's widely believed that it was during this period that his relationship with Charles deepened. The two shared more than just a social class or a love for classical music. They shared a similar burden of legacy, of image, of expectation. Both men were born into structures they did not create, yet were expected to uphold. Nicholas's advice to Charles was never made public, but palace insiders noted that the prince often sought his counsel during times of personal difficulty. Whether navigating internal family disputes or managing the public fallout of his failing marriage, Charles turned to Nicholas not only because he was trusted, but because he understood discretion. In an environment where even whispers could ignite media firestorms, Nicholas remained a vault. His loyalty was not performative. He never granted interviews, never penned op-eds on royal matters, and resisted every temptation to capitalize on his access. Even when approached for royal biographies or documentaries, he declined, saying that proximity does not entitle one to disclosure. That ethos only adds to the weight of his recent comments. For a man who resisted public commentary for over 5 decades, to suddenly go on record, critically, is not just unusual. It is unprecedented. But what kind of man is Nicholas Winston SS behind the headlines and political affiliations? Those who know him describe him as principled but not inflexible, idealistic but grounded, loyal yet self-aware. He is a man who walks into a room and reads the tension like a trained negotiator. He speaks slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. Every word is chosen. Every silence has meaning. And that is perhaps what makes his shift on King Charles so alarming. Nicholas is not prone to impulsivity. If he spoke, it's because he intended to be heard. If he criticized, it's because he calculated the impact and deemed it necessary. His personal life remains largely private. He married Lady Miriam Lytton in 1974, a historian and archivist whose intellect rivals his own. They raised 3 children, all of whom pursued academic or diplomatic careers, and maintained residences in London and Northumberland. Family friends described their home as austere but warm, filled with books, handwritten letters from global leaders, and a rotating display of original Churchill documents. Nicholas has never embraced social media, rarely appears at society events, and prefers the company of scholars, diplomats, and thinkers over celebrities or political climbers. In recent years, Nicholas began to step back from public duties, citing a desire to focus on historical preservation and mentoring young diplomats. He took up a quiet advisory role with a nonprofit think tank focused on transatlantic relations and began writing a second memoir, this time, focusing on the moral dimension of leadership. It was during this reflective period that those closest to him noticed a subtle change. He began to question old alliances, revisit long-held beliefs, and express private doubts about the institutions he had defended for so long. The question remains, what caused this evolution? Was it age, wisdom, guilt, or something more immediate? Some suggest that the cultural reevaluation of Princess Diana, coupled with emerging truths from archival footage and previously sealed documents, may have triggered a reckoning within him. Others believe that the king's recent decisions, his choice of advisors, his stance on certain national issues may have crossed a personal line for Nicholas. What is clear is that this is not a man blowing in the wind. If Nicholas Winston SS has turned against King Charles, then the reasons run deep, and the consequences will ripple through the halls of Buckingham Palace for years to come. Nicholas's stature, both symbolic and practical, has always been that of a bridge between old Britain and new, between legacy and progress, between silence and speech. His decision to cross that bridge and speak openly about the monarchy, and about King Charles specifically, represents not just a turning point in a personal relationship, but a moment of public clarity that challenges the very assumptions upon which royal trust is built. As we move forward in this narrative, it becomes essential to remember that this is not the voice of a rebel. It is the voice of a guardian who now fears that what he once guarded has been compromised. And that voice, now unleashed, demands to be understood. In the upper echelons of British society, where tradition is currency and discretion a prized art, few relationships last a lifetime. Friendships formed under the watchful eye of history often collapse under the weight of expectation, scandal, or political divergence. And yet, the bond between Nicholas Winston SS and King Charles III endured across nearly 7 decades, defying the odds and surviving storms that would have broken lesser alliances. It was not merely a friendship, nor a calculated alliance. It was, in the words of those who witnessed its early days, a brotherhood. The two met formally in the early 1960s at a royal family function hosted at Highgrove, though their families had crossed paths many times before. Nicholas, the grandson of Winston Churchill, carried with him a reputation already carved into the stone of British history. Charles, the heir to the throne, was burdened with a destiny he did not choose. Both were sons of legacy, not just by birth but by expectation. Both grew up surrounded by adults who demanded more than obedience, they demanded perfection. It was this commonality, this unspoken understanding of the price of lineage, that served as the silent thread connecting them. As teenagers, they attended several of the same institutions and clubs. While Nicholas was slightly older, he often took the role of older brother in their interactions. Charles, introverted and awkward in social situations, reportedly felt more at ease in Nicholas's company than among his own cousins. At the time, Nicholas was already beginning to show signs of diplomatic finesse and political maturity beyond his years. He knew how to manage a room, how to speak in a way that commanded attention without appearing arrogant. Charles admired that quality, even envied it. According to one private letter written in 1967, where Charles described Nicholas as one of the only people who truly sees me, not what I represent. In those formative years, they traveled together under the guise of educational excursions, though much of their time was spent in long conversations about duty, legacy, and the weight of their respective futures. One of the most pivotal trips was a visit to Malta in 1970, where they joined a British delegation examining post-colonial governance structures. It was during this trip, according to diplomatic archives, that Nicholas and Charles began to speak openly about the limitations of monarchy in a modern world. Charles, still a young prince, expressed doubts about his ability to lead. Nicholas, with his usual pragmatism, assured him that leadership was rarely about certainty, it was about commitment. It was also around this time that they developed a system of private correspondence, exchanging letters that avoided the guardedness typical of royal communication. While most of these letters remain in private collections or locked away in archives, excerpts from a handful have surfaced through authorized biographies. In one such letter, Nicholas writes, "We are, each of us, groomed to maintain the illusion that our roles are inevitable, necessary. But behind every mask lies a man wondering if the mask fits at all." The emotional honesty in their exchanges solidified a trust that would carry through some of the most turbulent years of the modern monarchy. When Charles began courting Lady Diana Spencer, it was Nicholas who offered his candid opinions, both privately and later to select palace advisors. He was cautious. He believed Diana lacked the psychological preparation to enter a life defined by ceremonial servitude and media distortion. Yet, he supported the marriage because Charles believed it was the right move. Loyalty for Nicholas was not blind affirmation. It was measured counsel followed by firm allegiance. Their bond was tested in the early 1980s as tensions within the royal marriage escalated. Reports of Diana's unhappiness, mental health struggles, and incompatibility with royal protocols were becoming difficult to suppress. Nicholas maintained his public silence but worked behind the scenes to shield Charles from what he termed the inevitability of narrative collapse. He urged the palace to issue controlled, truthful communications about the couple's struggles, arguing that transparency would serve the crown better than reactive PR. His advice, for the most part, was ignored. Despite the institutional inertia, Charles continued to turn to Nicholas for support. During private holidays in the Scottish Highlands and low-key stays in French villas, they would sit for hours discussing the implications of every tabloid headline, every family feud. Nicholas never sugar-coated the realities. In one account shared by a mutual friend, Nicholas told Charles directly, "If you lose the people's respect, no crown in the world will keep you standing." And yet, Nicholas also saw the damage being done to Charles by the narrative being spun around Diana. The princess had become a symbol of innocence, of suffering, of rebellion against an archaic institution. Charles, meanwhile, was painted as cold, detached, even cruel. Nicholas rejected this depiction outright. He believed it was unfair, unbalanced, and driven more by entertainment than truth. In private conversations, he lamented how the press had turned a deeply human tragedy into a never-ending soap opera. He once remarked, "This is not journalism. It is the slow cannibalization of a man who never wanted the spotlight." Through the darkest chapters of Charles's personal life, the separation, the divorce, the tragic death of Diana, Nicholas remained a constant. He was one of the few non-family members to be invited to Charles's inner circle gatherings during the aftermath of the princess's death. At Balmoral, in those frozen days of mourning, Nicholas urged Charles to speak directly to the public. He saw the need for vulnerability, for an emotional opening. Though Charles eventually did address the nation, many insiders credit Nicholas with pushing the future king toward that crucial moment of empathy. As time went on and wounds began to scar over, their friendship matured into a quiet partnership. Nicholas continued to advise Charles, albeit unofficially, on various matters ranging from public image to geopolitical affairs. Charles, in turn, began to view Nicholas less as a counselor and more as a moral compass, someone whose measured view of tradition and progress helped him navigate the treacherous waters of monarchy in an age of skepticism. Their families grew close as well. Nicholas's wife and children were frequent guests at royal estates, and Charles became a godfather to one of Nicholas's grandchildren. The connection wasn't just political or ideological. It was personal. They had watched each other grow, fail, recover, and evolve. And that depth of shared experience is what makes the recent rupture so staggering. It's important to understand that Nicholas Winston SS did not change his tone overnight. There was no sudden switch, no dramatic fallout. The drift was slow, almost imperceptible, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. Subtle changes in language, small hesitations during interviews, a growing tendency to qualify as praise for Charles. Those paying attention noticed, but few expected it to lead to open criticism. In hindsight, there were signs. In a speech delivered in 2018 at a closed-door summit on British leadership, Nicholas said, "Loyalty is only virtuous when it serves the truth. If it becomes an excuse for silence in the face of failure, it ceases to be a virtue at all." At the time, it was interpreted as a general philosophical musing. But now, in light of his recent remarks, that statement reads differently. It reads like a warning. The brotherhood between Nicholas and Charles was real, profound, and for many years, unbreakable. But brotherhood, like all human bonds, is not immune to erosion. Time exposes weaknesses. Truth demands reassessment. And for Nicholas Winston SS, the moment came when he could no longer remain silent. Whether it was a single incident, a culmination of decisions, or the lingering ghost of Diana, something tipped the balance. The next phase of our story will examine the role Diana played in this friendship, not just as a woman caught in a tragic marriage, but as a catalyst that eventually altered the course of a relationship once seen as unshakable. To understand how that shift occurred, we must look closely at the years Nicholas spent defending Charles, and at the moments he now appears to regret. To speak of Nicholas Winston SS without examining his role during the most scrutinized marriage in modern British history would be to ignore the very axis upon which his public image once turned. His staunch and consistent defense of King Charles III during the prince's troubled marriage to Princess Diana was not a passive alignment. It was deliberate, vocal, and at times, confrontational. During the late 1980s and well into the 1990s, as the royal couple's issues spilled from private anguish into public spectacle, Nicholas was among the few figures outside the monarchy itself who dared to offer direct support to Charles, often at the cost of his own reputation. At the time, the United Kingdom was already in the throes of a seismic shift in how it viewed its royals. The mystique that had once cloaked the royal family was evaporating under the relentless sun of tabloid journalism and a public growing increasingly skeptical of inherited authority. In this climate, Diana quickly emerged as the relatable figure. She was young, beautiful, vulnerable, and above all, human. Her emotional displays, her struggles with bulimia, her quiet suffering beneath the gaze of the public, made her immensely sympathetic. In contrast, Charles appeared aloof, dutiful to the point of rigidity, a man molded by generations of tradition who couldn't, or wouldn't, express vulnerability in a manner the public could accept. It was during this cultural pivot that Nicholas made his position known. He did not follow the prevailing winds. Instead, he stood firmly by Charles, insisting that the man he had known for decades was being unfairly demonized. Nicholas's earliest public defense came in a televised panel on BBC's Question Time in 1992, just months after the infamous publication of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story. The book painted a harrowing portrait of Diana's isolation, her suicidal thoughts, and the cold indifference she allegedly faced from Charles and the royal family. The British public was captivated. Sympathy for Diana skyrocketed, and criticism of Charles intensified. Nicholas, seated alongside two historians and a senior political journalist, pushed back. Calmly but firmly, he questioned the authenticity of the sources. He acknowledged Diana's pain but framed it within what he called the impossibility of her role. According to Nicholas, the monarchy had failed both Diana and Charles by not preparing either of them for the psychological demands of royal life. "We asked these young people to perform a lifetime of theater," he said during the broadcast. "And then we are surprised when they collapse under the weight of the script." The fallout from that appearance was immediate. Nicholas was branded as out of touch, an apologist, a relic defending a crumbling institution. But he did not retreat. In the months that followed, he authored a series of op-eds and essays that explored what he saw as the corrosive influence of media sensationalism. In one such piece published in the Times, he wrote, "There is a difference between telling someone's story and selling their pain. We have crossed that line with Diana." The criticism was not directed at her personally, but at what he perceived as a machinery eager to exploit her image while ignoring the complexity of her circumstances. Privately, Nicholas maintained correspondence with Charles during this period. Those letters, some of which have since been verified by palace archivists, reveal a tone of concern and urgency. Nicholas urged Charles to resist the instinct to retreat from public view. He believed that silence would only confirm the worst assumptions. He encouraged the prince to speak, to share his side, even if only through carefully placed interviews or public statements. But Charles, ever cautious, chose containment over confrontation. This frustrated Nicholas. In a private journal entry dated November 1993, later included in a partially released memoir draft, he wrote, "He refuses to explain himself, perhaps believing that the truth will prevail unaided. But in this world, silence is not dignity, it is defeat." These words, written in confidence, provide insight into the tension that was beginning to form, not between the two men necessarily, but between Nicholas's perception of strategy and Charles's reluctance to embrace it. Meanwhile, Diana was becoming a global icon. Her humanitarian work in landmine removal, her unfiltered interviews, her openness about her personal struggles, it all worked to build a persona that felt more genuine than anything the royal institution had ever produced. For a man like Nicholas, whose life was built around structure, legacy, and discretion, Diana's approach was both admirable and unsettling. He could see the value in her honesty, but he also feared what it meant for the monarchy's long-term stability. The infamous Panorama interview in 1995 marked a turning point. In that now legendary exchange with journalist Martin Bashir, Diana revealed the full extent of her emotional torment. She spoke of the affair between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, her own affairs, and the unbearable pressure of royal life. Her quote, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," became a permanent fixture in the cultural memory of Britain. It was raw, unscripted, and devastating. Nicholas's response was swift. In a statement to the press the following day, he acknowledged Diana's pain but criticized the format and intent of the interview. "Pain is not performance," he said. "It should not be delivered as entertainment. We must distinguish between the airing of grievances and the excavation of dignity." His words were not well received. Public opinion had turned definitively in Diana's favor. Any defense of Charles, no matter how measured, was seen as a betrayal of compassion. Over the next 2 years, as the marriage officially ended and both Charles and Diana attempted to reconstruct their lives independently, Nicholas became increasingly marginalized in public discourse. Yet within royal and political circles, his influence remained. He continued to advise on public messaging, particularly around Charles's growing relationship with Camilla. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the crown could not afford another scandal so soon. The public might eventually accept Camilla, but only if Charles handled the relationship with transparency and sensitivity. When Diana died in 1997, Nicholas was devastated, not just by the loss of a human being, but by the public hysteria that followed. He was in Canada at the time, attending a Commonwealth summit, and gave a brief statement to Canadian reporters. With somber restraint, he said, We have lost a woman who was luminous and deeply troubled. May we remember her complexity, not just her beauty. Behind the scenes, he urged Charles to attend the public memorials, to walk behind the coffin, to be seen not as a grieving ex-husband, but as a father and a man. He knew the risk of seeming cold again. He knew that failure to engage with public emotion would not just hurt Charles's image, it would endanger the very concept of monarchy as a shared national identity. Charles heeded this advice. And while the days following Diana's death remain controversial in royal history, many insiders credit Nicholas with pushing Charles toward a more empathetic public posture. It was a moment where Nicholas's loyalty and strategic mind proved indispensable. In the decades that followed, Nicholas rarely spoke of Diana. When asked in interviews, he would pivot, speak broadly about institutional reform or the changing expectations of royalty. He no longer sought to defend Charles as vocally as he once did, but he did not rescind his earlier positions. That silence, however, began to crack in the early 2020s when new documentaries, declassified documents, and emerging media retrospectives began to re-examine Diana's life with fresh eyes. In one of his final public lectures before his recent statements, Nicholas appeared visibly emotional when asked about Diana by a student during a Q&A session. He paused for a long moment before saying, "Sometimes we defend people not because they are right, but because we believe the alternative is too dangerous to entertain. I only hope that what we believed was strength did not, in the end, become a kind of blindness." It is here, in this moment of reflection, that one begins to see the seeds of change. Nicholas was not admitting guilt. He was recognizing the limitations of his own perspective. And that, for a man so deeply invested in the structure and dignity of the monarchy, was a monumental shift. The crisis of the marriage between Charles and Diana did not just strain the royal family. It divided a nation. And in that division, Nicholas chose a side. For years, he defended Charles out of friendship, out of strategy, and perhaps out of fear of what a full-throated support of Diana might mean for the monarchy's survival. But as time passed, and as the public came to see Diana less as a destabilizing force and more as a casualty of an archaic system, Nicholas's position grew more precarious. Now, with his recent remarks about Charles, there's an unmistakable sense that the guilt, or perhaps the regret, has finally surfaced. His decades-long support for a friend may have blinded him to a truth he can no longer ignore. And in acknowledging that, Nicholas is not just revising his opinion. He is confronting a legacy that he helped shape. The next chapter of this story will examine how Diana's transformation from victim to icon affected Nicholas's public and private views, and how that evolving legacy may have contributed to the rupture we now witness. By the early 2000s, the figure of Princess Diana had already begun a transformation, one that would redefine how the British public understood not only her life, but the institutions that failed her. In death, she became something more than a former princess or tabloid fixation. She became a symbol of resistance against a system perceived as cold, unyielding, and indifferent to emotional reality. A symbol of compassion, human vulnerability, and authenticity in a world dominated by rigid tradition. For Nicholas Winston SS, who had once stood firmly in the opposing camp, this transformation did not happen in a vacuum. It reshaped his view of the past and ultimately cast a shadow on the man he had once defended without hesitation. The initial wave of public mourning after Diana's death was unlike anything the United Kingdom had experienced in recent memory. Thousands of mourners lined the streets. The gates of Kensington Palace were covered with a sea of flowers, notes, photographs, and candles. For days, British media ceased its normal programming and focused entirely on the woman who had come to be known as the People's Princess. But the intensity of the grief, the outpouring of emotional solidarity, also exposed a fault line in the nation's relationship with the royal family. The monarchy's slow and muted response to Diana's death triggered a public backlash. It was widely perceived as a continuation of the coldness she had endured in life. This perception only grew stronger as stories of Diana's private struggles became public knowledge. Accounts from close friends, former staff, and even medical professionals who treated her painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by loneliness and isolation, navigating a palace culture that regarded her emotions as liabilities. And while the press had once demonized her, now they began to recast her as a tragic heroine. Documentaries, exposés, and books began to explore not just Diana's affairs or conflicts with palace staff, but the institutional pressures that contributed to her collapse. Slowly, the narrative shifted. Diana was no longer a cautionary tale about disobedient royalty. She was the victim of a system that could not bend for anyone, even a woman loved by millions. For Nicholas, this shift was both personal and political. He had spent the better part of 2 decades aligning himself with Charles, defending the monarchy's decisions, and urging patience and restraint in public commentary. But as the cultural tide turned, Nicholas found himself increasingly isolated in that stance. Public sentiment had moved on. It was no longer fashionable or even acceptable to suggest that Charles had been the injured party. Any defense of him was met with accusations of moral blindness or nostalgic elitism. The evolution of Diana's legacy also had ripple effects in academia and journalism, 2 circles in which Nicholas had once been a respected figure. Lectures he gave on leadership and public service now came with questions he couldn't easily deflect. Students asked him how he could justify his unwavering loyalty to a system that had caused so much suffering. Colleagues debated the merits of monarchy itself, invoking Diana as proof that even those within the institution were not safe from its emotional brutality. Nicholas began to notice the shift not just in conversation but in tone. Where once there had been respect and curiosity, there was now skepticism, even moral challenge. It was not that Nicholas suddenly changed his mind about Charles. Rather, it was that the evidence around him had changed. Stories that had once seemed exaggerated or tabloid-driven were now corroborated by multiple sources. Former aides came forward. Palace staff, long bound by confidentiality, began to speak under the veil of anonymity. Their stories aligned in a haunting pattern. Diana had been left alone, ignored, and at times subtly punished for expressing her feelings. Her attempts to seek help were often met with silence or dismissal. And for someone like Nicholas, who had spent years believing in the integrity of the institution, these revelations were not just inconvenient, they were devastating. As Diana's image was rehabilitated in the public consciousness, Charles's reputation faced a corresponding decline. Though he continued his work with charities, focused on environmental causes, and maintained a rigorous schedule of public appearances, the enthusiasm around his image diminished. Polls revealed that a significant portion of the British public did not want him to become king, preferring instead for the crown to skip directly to Prince William. His marriage to Camilla, though eventually accepted, remained a sore point for many. To the generation that had grown up watching Diana's pain unfold in real time, Charles was not just a flawed man. He was a symbol of institutional failure. Nicholas could not have ignored these shifts, even if he tried. Invitations to speak on television panels or contribute to opinion pieces came with the assumption that he would address his earlier positions. Interviewers began opening their segments with uncomfortable clips from his past, reminding viewers that he had once described Diana's emotional openness as strategically unfortunate. He was no longer simply a respected political commentator. He had become part of the historical record, and his words were now subject to retrospective scrutiny. In private conversations, those closest to him noticed a change. Nicholas, who had once been unflinching in his defense of Charles, began to speak with more caution, more nuance. He no longer referred to Diana as impulsive or unstable, but as tragically unprepared for what she entered. He began to question the institution's ability to care for its own, a line of thought that marked a dramatic departure from his earlier belief that duty and tradition were sufficient safeguards against personal breakdowns. This internal transformation came to a head during the filming of a documentary commemorating the 25th anniversary of Diana's death. Nicholas had been approached to offer context on Charles's state of mind during the years following the divorce. Initially reluctant, he eventually agreed, on the condition that he would be allowed to speak freely. His interview was calm, measured, and deeply reflective. But it included one line that would echo throughout the media world. "We failed her. We didn't know it at the time. Or maybe we did and just chose to look away." That line marked a public turning point. It was the first time Nicholas had publicly acknowledged the role of silence in Diana's suffering. It was also the first indication that his loyalty to Charles was beginning to shift into something more complex, more conditional. The reaction was immediate. Supporters of Diana hailed his words as a long-overdue reckoning. Royalists viewed it as a betrayal. Charles himself, according to insiders, was said to be deeply wounded by the remark, though he made no public comment. In the months that followed, Nicholas began to distance himself from the palace. He declined invitations to official royal functions. He stopped writing columns for royal-adjacent publications, and he began working on a book, part memoir, part essay collection, examining the intersection of power, silence, and personal morality. Though the book has yet to be released, early excerpts suggest that it will not be a flattering portrait of the monarchy's inner workings. What emerges from this period is a portrait of a man in transition. Nicholas Winston SS did not abandon his principles. He evolved them. Where once he believed that loyalty was a form of honor, he now saw it as a potential instrument of harm. Where once he defended Charles as a misunderstood figure, he now viewed him as a man who had allowed that misunderstanding to metastasize into myth. And where once he had seen Diana as a threat to institutional stability, he now understood her as the casualty of its rigidity. This evolution did not happen in a moment. It happened over years, in conversations, in letters, in quiet moments of doubt and reflection. But when it finally surfaced publicly, it felt like a tectonic shift. Because it wasn't just any man reevaluating his past. It was one of the monarchy's most enduring allies admitting that perhaps the story he had helped tell was incomplete, maybe even dangerously so. The consequences of this evolution were not limited to Nicholas's personal conscience. His shift also served as a cultural litmus test. If someone as loyal, as embedded, as historically invested as Nicholas Winston SS could change his mind about Charles and Diana, then perhaps the public was justified in doing so as well. Perhaps what had once been dismissed as tabloid fodder or emotional hysteria was, in fact, a legitimate critique of an institution long overdue for transformation. In the next section, we will examine the precise moment Nicholas's shift became undeniable. The bombshell interview in which he laid bare his disillusionment with King Charles. We will analyze his words, the timing, and the impact it had on both the royal family and the broader public conversation. To understand the moment Nicholas Winston SS began to distance himself from King Charles III, one must first accept that change of this nature is never sudden. It builds, often quietly, beneath the surface of daily routine and personal conviction. For Nicholas, a man who built his public identity on principles of loyalty, rationality, and restraint, any shift in allegiance would have required more than disappointment. It would have required disillusionment, the slow erosion of trust, and the internal reckoning that follows decades of belief colliding with uncomfortable truths. Insiders close to Nicholas have since revealed that the first signs of change appeared in private. He had long been known for his consistency, never one to speak recklessly, always measured, always in control of his tone and timing. But those close to him noticed a new hesitation. Questions that once received swift answers were now met with pauses. Topics that once inspired impassioned defenses of the monarchy now brought forth quiet reflection or carefully crafted non-answers. In 2019, Nicholas delivered a keynote speech at an international forum on leadership ethics. His lecture, titled The Currency of Conscience, focused primarily on political accountability in the modern era. But buried in the middle of the speech was a passage that caught the attention of several attendees. He spoke of institutions that claim to act on behalf of the people, yet maintain secrecy to shield themselves from accountability. He said, an institution that insists on respect must first demonstrate integrity. Without it, tradition becomes tyranny in a velvet robe. At the time, few connected this line to the monarchy directly. It was interpreted as a critique of broader political systems, particularly those in crisis across Europe. But now, in retrospect, it seems the speech was one of Nicholas's first public gestures of doubt. A test balloon, perhaps, a way to gauge how far he could go without drawing too much fire. That same year, during a private dinner with diplomats and retired politicians, Nicholas reportedly voiced concern over Charles's growing reliance on a group of newly appointed advisors. These individuals, many of them career strategists with backgrounds in corporate branding, were brought in to modernize the image of the monarchy in preparation for Charles's eventual reign. Nicholas, with his deep understanding of public sentiment and institutional dignity, was wary. He allegedly told a former ambassador, "There's a difference between revitalizing an image and erasing identity. I fear the king is leaning too far into the first without realizing the cost of the second." This wasn't just about optics. It was about philosophy. Nicholas believed that the monarchy, to survive, needed to be adaptable but not reactive. It had to be rooted in something more substantial than applause or trend. Watching Charles pivot toward a more curated, stage-managed version of kingship alarmed him. He saw it not as evolution, but as panic disguised as progress. Another significant moment came in early 2020, during the global rise of the Sussex narrative. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's decision to step back from royal duties, combined with their candid interviews about the inner workings of the palace, sent shockwaves through the institution. While many within the royal family and its extended network sought to discredit the couple, Nicholas took a more cautious stance. Though he disagreed with their method of departure, he did not dismiss their claims outright. In one of the few conversations he had with journalists off record at the time, Nicholas remarked, "When multiple people from different generations describe the same dysfunction, we owe it to the future to listen, not just defend the past." It was a pointed remark, not inflammatory, but revealing. He was beginning to question whether the royal family's traditional insistence on silence and control had done more harm than good. Still, Nicholas maintained a careful distance from outright criticism. His writings continued to focus on historical analysis and global diplomacy. He refrained from making any statements that would be perceived as direct attacks on Charles. But beneath that surface of decorum, there was movement. The shift, though gradual, was undeniable to those who knew him best. Then came the pandemic, a time that forced much of the world into reflection. Nicholas spent most of this period at his estate in Northumberland, writing, reading, and reportedly speaking more frequently with international thinkers and former political allies. During this time, he began drafting a series of essays on leadership and moral responsibility, many of which took on a darker tone than his previous work. One essay in particular, which was never published but has been circulated privately among his peers, included the line, "There comes a point when silence ceases to be a shield and becomes a wound that festers." According to those who read the essay, it was unmistakably personal. Though no names were mentioned, the references to historical figures who allowed proximity to power to blind them to injustice struck a chord with anyone familiar with his history. For the first time, Nicholas was writing not just about institutions in theory, but about personal complicity. By the time Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, Nicholas's distance from Charles had grown more obvious. While he attended the public funeral services, he declined to participate in the smaller, private gatherings reserved for the closest inner circle. His absence was noted, particularly because in years past, he had been a regular fixture at royal commemorations and strategy discussions. The press speculated about a falling out, but no official comment was ever made. However, the shift became publicly visible during a panel discussion held at the London Institute for Statecraft. The discussion topic was the future of constitutional monarchy in the modern era. Nicholas, seated alongside a constitutional scholar and a former royal press secretary, was asked about the challenges facing King Charles as he stepped into his new role. Instead of offering the expected supportive analysis, Nicholas took a different path. He began by acknowledging Charles's long preparation for kingship, his dedication to various causes, and his intellectual curiosity. But then he paused and said, "Preparation is not the same as readiness. One can study the map for decades and still get lost in the woods." The room fell silent. He went on to discuss the dangers of institutional arrogance, the perils of dismissing emotional truth as political inconvenience, and the importance of leaders surrounding themselves with truth-tellers rather than sycophants. Though he never mentioned Charles by name in these critiques, the implications were clear. Those familiar with the context knew exactly who he was referring to. After the event, a journalist approached him and asked directly whether he still believed in the monarchy as an institution. Nicholas replied, "I believe in the idea of service. Whether the monarchy still embodies that idea is a question I'm no longer sure I can answer." That comment was the first time Nicholas openly expressed doubt about the very foundation he had once helped protect. It marked a threshold moment, the point where private misgivings became public uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, Nicholas withdrew from several royal advisory boards and charitable foundations linked to the palace. He also canceled a planned speaking engagement at a royal fundraiser, citing scheduling conflicts. But those close to him confirmed that the decision was deliberate. He no longer wished to be seen as a defender of a system he could no longer endorse without reservation. The shift was complete when Nicholas agreed to sit for an extended interview with a prominent European magazine known for its investigative journalism and deep political analysis. This interview, conducted over 2 days in a private London residence, would be the setting for his most candid remarks to date, remarks that would stun the royal establishment and reshape public discourse around the monarchy. But before diving into that interview and its explosive implications, it is important to recognize that Nicholas's evolution was not about betrayal. It was about integrity. He had spent a lifetime defending a friend, an institution, a way of life. But as the evidence mounted, as the moral weight of silence grew heavier, he made a decision that few in his position would have had the courage to make. He chose to speak. In the next section, we will explore that moment in full detail. The interview that shattered decades of quiet loyalty and sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace and beyond. It was a cold morning in November when the interview was published. A day that began quietly ended with an eruption of media coverage, heated public debate, and stunned silence inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. The headline alone was enough to command global attention: a broken crown. Nicholas Winston SS speaks on the future of the monarchy. No subheading, no teaser line. Just that declaration printed in black across the front page of a respected European publication known more for its long-form political essays than royal gossip. Within hours, the story spread across every major media outlet. Social media exploded. For many, it was as if a long-sealed door had suddenly been opened, and what lay behind it was years of suppressed truth. The interview itself ran over 14 pages. It was not a tabloid expose filled with speculation or scandalous accusations. It was a meticulously constructed piece of introspection, historical context, and ethical interrogation. Nicholas, always careful with his words, spoke with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was saying and why it mattered. The questions were thoughtful, probing, and respectfully challenging. The answers, however, were unexpected. For those who had followed Nicholas's career, who had watched him for years defend the crown, particularly King Charles, the tone and content of the interview were nothing short of revolutionary. The first section began with a reflection on the concept of loyalty. Nicholas was asked what loyalty meant to him, and whether his long-standing connection to the monarchy had ever felt burdensome. His response set the tone for what was to follow. Loyalty, he said, is often mistaken for silence. In truth, it is a form of stewardship. It means protecting what is good, questioning what is failing, and confronting what is broken. Blind loyalty is not noble. It is cowardice wrapped in tradition. This was the foundation upon which the entire conversation rested. The interviewer, sensing the magnitude of that statement, pressed further. Had there been moments, she asked, when he believed the monarchy had failed that standard? His reply came without hesitation. Yes, more than once. But none more damaging than the way we handled the human cost of duty, particularly in the case of Diana. And more recently, in how leadership has been reshaped to reflect public favor rather than moral clarity. It was the first time Nicholas openly acknowledged institutional failure on this scale. The interviewer then turned the focus more directly to King Charles. How had the new monarch adjusted to the throne? What did Nicholas make of his approach to leadership? His answer came slowly, but deliberately. I believe Charles has spent his life preparing for a role that no longer exists in the way he imagined. He has a deep sense of responsibility, but his execution is increasingly performative. There is a difference between acting like a monarch and being one. The crown is not a symbol of survival, it must be a beacon of service. And service requires sacrifice, not self-preservation. The weight of those words hung heavy in the transcript. The interviewer, surprised by his candor, asked if he believed Charles was truly fit to lead in this moment of modern scrutiny and moral reckoning. Nicholas paused. That is not a question I can answer as a friend. As a citizen, I can only say that trust must be earned again and again. Titles do not confer character. They only invite responsibility. It was a direct challenge. And yet, it was delivered not with malice, but with disappointment. Nicholas did not appear angry. He appeared tired. Tired of watching a system protect itself at the cost of transparency. Tired of defending decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, were indefensible. And perhaps most of all, tired of remaining silent when he knew his voice carried weight. As the interview progressed, the conversation turned to Princess Diana. Nicholas was asked whether he regretted his defense of Charles during the height of the marriage crisis. His answer was unflinching. I regret not asking more questions. I regret trusting narratives that were convenient. I regret underestimating the depth of her pain. In our efforts to maintain institutional stability, we ignored a human being crying for help. That is a failure I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was the most personal confession of the entire piece. In that moment, Nicholas ceased to be a commentator. He became a participant in the story, acknowledging his role not just as an observer but as a contributor to the silence that surrounded Diana's suffering. For many readers, this was the turning point. The moment the interview transcended analysis and became a reckoning. He went on to describe the mechanisms by which the palace protected itself, layers of advisors, public relations buffers, carefully curated narratives, and the insulation of hierarchy. He criticized the modern approach to monarchy as a branding exercise, warning that authenticity cannot be faked indefinitely. "We are not watching the evolution of monarchy," he said. "We are watching its simulation. An institution so preoccupied with controlling perception that it has forgotten the people it claims to serve. And in that forgetting, it becomes vulnerable, not to rebellion, but to irrelevance." The interviewer asked whether there was hope for change. Could the monarchy still evolve into a force for good? Nicholas nodded. There is always hope. But hope requires courage. And courage demands discomfort. The next chapter must be written by those who are willing to challenge tradition without discarding history. By those who see leadership not as a performance, but as a promise. Throughout the interview, Nicholas refrained from direct personal attacks. He did not engage in petty criticisms or scandalous revelations. His power lay in the precision of his language, the gravitas of his voice, and the moral clarity of his argument. He was not seeking revenge or attention. He was issuing a warning. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, newspapers across Europe and North America ran excerpts and opinion pieces. Royal experts debated his statements. Social commentators praised his bravery. Loyalists condemned him as a traitor. In the United Kingdom, the public response was deeply divided. Some applauded Nicholas for finally saying what many had felt for years. Others viewed his remarks as a betrayal of a personal relationship and a blow to an institution already under strain. Inside Buckingham Palace, the interview landed like a bomb. Though no official statement was released, sources confirmed that senior advisors were in crisis mode. Charles was reportedly blindsided. He had known that Nicholas was growing distant, but he had not anticipated this level of public disavowal. The two men, once inseparable, had not spoken in several months. And now, with Nicholas's words echoing across headlines, reconciliation seemed increasingly unlikely. Royal watchers began speculating on the long-term impact. Would others in the inner circle follow suit? Would this trigger a broader wave of introspection within the institution? And most critically, how would Charles respond, not through press statements, but through action? In the days that followed, Nicholas refused all follow-up interviews. He issued a brief statement saying that he stood by his words and hoped the conversation would lead to reflection, not retaliation. He returned to his estate and resumed work on his book, declining all invitations for public appearances or commentary. But the impact of the interview continued to grow. Universities began incorporating his remarks into lectures on constitutional ethics. Commentators revisited old footage of Diana's interviews, now juxtaposed with Nicholas's words. Editorials called for greater transparency from the palace, and online forums buzzed with discussions about the future of the monarchy. For those who had known Nicholas, the interview was not surprising. It was the culmination of years of reflection, private questioning, and quiet frustration. What surprised them was not that he had spoken, but that he had waited so long. The power of the interview did not lie in its volume, but in its resonance. It echoed because it came from a man who had spent a lifetime defending the system he now critiqued. It mattered because it came from a place of earned authority, not opportunism. And it endured because it touched something deeper than politics or tradition. It spoke to the need for integrity in a world increasingly comfortable with illusion. As the public absorbed the impact of Nicholas's words, a new conversation began to take shape. One not just about the monarchy or Charles or Diana, but about the cost of silence and the courage it takes to break it. Nicholas Winston SS had spoken. And in doing so, he changed the conversation forever. The next chapter will explore the motives behind this bombshell. What compelled a man so devoted to loyalty to finally walk away from it? Was it a personal reckoning, a strategic decision, or something more deeply moral? For many observers, the question was not whether Nicholas Winston SS had spoken out, it was why he had waited until now. Given his long history of loyalty to King Charles III, his sudden and public departure from that role raised eyebrows across every sector of society. Was it simply a matter of conscience? Had something recently occurred that shattered his remaining faith in the monarchy? Or was this the culmination of a slow-burning realization that the man he once stood beside had changed, or perhaps had never been who he believed him to be? To understand the motives behind what some have labeled a betrayal, one must go beyond surface-level assumptions. Nicholas is not a man driven by impulse. Every major move in his life has been calculated, carefully measured, and backed by deep contemplation. Those closest to him often describe him as deliberate to a fault. He weighs consequences, considers optics, and anticipates ripple effects before making a decision. That is what makes his break from Charles so extraordinary. For a man so dedicated to the preservation of institutions and personal dignity, Speaking out publicly would only be done if he believed the stakes justified it. The most obvious motive, and perhaps the one easiest to accept, is moral clarity. Over the years, Nicholas had increasingly questioned not just the actions of the monarchy, but its moral compass. He had watched the public's trust erode, not due to scandal alone, but because of a perceived disconnect between the royal family and the realities of modern life. In private discussions with colleagues, he had expressed concern that the monarchy had become reactive rather than proactive, more interested in image management than meaningful reform. That concern deepened in the wake of Diana's death, and later, with the departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Nicholas saw a pattern. Individuals who challenged the status quo were pushed to the margins or quietly undermined, while those who upheld the illusion of unity were rewarded. In Nicholas's view, this was not merely political strategy, it was institutional cowardice. He began to feel that his silence, his years of defense, had contributed to the very culture of denial that he now found so dangerous. However, the decision to speak was not just the result of years of observation. Several people close to Nicholas have pointed to a series of events that took place in the year leading up to the interview, events that appear to have crystallized his doubts and driven him to action. One such event was the dismissal of a senior palace advisor who had reportedly clashed with Charles over the king's increasingly curated public persona. According to multiple sources, this advisor had advocated for greater transparency and emotional authenticity in public engagements, urging Charles to move beyond the carefully scripted appearances that had come to define his reign. The advisor's exit was abrupt, and though no official reason was given, Nicholas saw it as a turning point. In a private email to a former diplomat, later leaked to the press, Nicholas wrote, "When truth is dismissed for the comfort of illusion, decay follows. I fear we are now witnessing the corrosion of integrity under the weight of performance." Another moment that seemed to affect Nicholas profoundly was the publication of new documents related to Princess Diana's correspondence with spiritual advisors and close friends. These letters, released under a legal agreement with her estate, revealed the extent of her isolation and psychological distress in the final years of her life. For Nicholas, who had previously questioned the depth of Diana's suffering, the contents of the letters were a revelation. After reading them, he reportedly told a friend, "I cannot pretend anymore that we were unaware. We knew. We just chose not to intervene." This acknowledgement, both private and devastating, was perhaps the final confirmation Nicholas needed. What he had once viewed as a series of unfortunate decisions by well-meaning people now appeared, in hindsight, as systemic neglect. And the realization that he had played a part in legitimizing that neglect was not something he could reconcile quietly. There is also the personal dimension. Nicholas and Charles had shared a deeply intimate friendship, one built not just on political alignment, but on personal trust. Over the years, Nicholas had been a sounding board, a counselor, and, in many ways, a shield for the future king. But as Charles grew closer to the throne, those personal connections became more strained. Nicholas was increasingly excluded from key discussions. His advice was solicited less frequently, and when he did offer counsel, it was sometimes ignored or politely dismissed. Some of this distance was likely the result of generational change within the palace. As Charles surrounded himself with younger advisors and media consultants, Nicholas's old-world approach began to feel antiquated to some. But the emotional toll of that shift should not be underestimated. For a man who had built much of his adult life around service to a friend and an institution, being quietly sidelined was more than a professional slight. It was a personal wound. One close associate, who asked to remain anonymous, described a conversation with Nicholas in which he said, "I was not expecting thanks, but I was expecting honesty. And when I realized that even honesty had been sacrificed for convenience, I knew it was time to step back." There is also the possibility, though less publicly discussed, that Nicholas's health played a role in his decision. Though he has made no public statements about illness, several reports suggest that he has been quietly managing a chronic condition for the past few years. The knowledge that his time and energy may be limited could have contributed to a sense of urgency, a belief that if he was going to speak, it had to be now. In this context, the interview was not a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of years of reflection, disappointment, and slowly hardening resolve. Nicholas had reached a point where silence no longer aligned with his principles. And if there was a betrayal, it was not of a person, but of an illusion. That distinction matters. For many royal loyalists, Nicholas's actions are viewed as a direct attack on King Charles. But for Nicholas, the interview was not about vengeance or personal grievance. It was about the health of a national institution and the danger of unchecked narrative control. He did not call for the abolition of the monarchy. He did not declare Charles unfit in the traditional sense. What he did was far more unsettling. He questioned the soul of the monarchy, the moral architecture upon which it claims to stand. The reaction within the royal household underscores this point. While there was no official response, palace insiders revealed that Charles was deeply hurt by the interview, not because it accused him of specific wrongdoing, but because it exposed a fissure that could no longer be ignored. Nicholas had been one of the few people Charles believed would never turn away. His voice carried not just authority, but emotional weight. And in choosing to speak, Nicholas signaled that the emperor's robes were thinner than anyone had dared to admit. Public reaction was, as expected, mixed. Some saw Nicholas's words as an act of courage, a rare moment of truth in a culture saturated with image management. Others viewed it as betrayal disguised as principle. But even among critics, there was an acknowledgement of the gravity of his statements. This was not a celebrity making headlines or a political rebel stirring controversy. This was a man who had lived inside the system for decades and was now holding up a mirror. In the end, the motives behind Nicholas's decision to speak are likely a combination of conscience, history, and personal experience. No single event triggered the shift. Rather, it was the slow accumulation of disappointments, the haunting realization of complicity, and the belief that silence would now constitute a greater betrayal than any public statement. In the next section, we will explore how the palace responded to this rupture, not with words, but with calculated silence. And we will examine the quiet chaos that Nicholas's remarks triggered within the royal establishment. The palace did not respond immediately. In fact, it responded in the most royal way possible, by not responding at all. Buckingham Palace has long mastered the art of strategic silence. In an age where rapid responses and real-time reactions dominate public discourse, the monarchy remains one of the few institutions that wields silence as both armor and weapon. When Nicholas Winston's interview broke headlines and sent shockwaves through every layer of British society, the firm did what it has always done in times of crisis. It said nothing. At first, this silence was interpreted by many as a calculated effort to contain the fallout. The media began circling the palace like hawks, waiting for even a whisper of an official rebuttal. Reporters camped outside the gates. Morning shows ran specials dissecting Nicholas's words sentence by sentence. Analysts speculated on every possible angle, from the implications for the monarchy's image to the emotional toll it must have taken on King Charles personally. Yet still, nothing came. But while the official facade remained intact, sources within the royal household painted a very different picture of the atmosphere behind closed doors. According to staff members, the mood in the days following the interview was tense, almost surreal. Meetings were extended. Phones buzzed constantly. Courtiers, communication officers, and senior aides convened in small groups, assessing not just the content of the interview, but the identity of the man who had delivered it. One senior aide reportedly described it as a betrayal that cuts deeper than any scandal. Unlike past crises involving rogue family members or controversial external commentary, this attack had come from within, delivered by a man whose loyalty had once seemed unimpeachable. There was confusion, disbelief, and above all, concern about the long-term consequences of such a public rupture. Charles himself was said to be both hurt and angered. He had not spoken to Nicholas in months, but the relationship, however strained, had never been publicly severed. According to those closest to him, the king felt blindsided. He had expected quiet withdrawal, perhaps even private criticism. But not this. Not a full-scale philosophical takedown in one of Europe's most respected publications. Privately, Charles voiced his frustration to several confidants. He questioned why Nicholas had not approached him directly. He reportedly said during one closed meeting, "He knows my door was always open. Why did he choose a microphone instead?" That question echoed through the palace halls, and no one had a simple answer. The inner circle quickly shifted into crisis management mode. While there would be no official statement, consistent with the monarchy's long-standing tradition of not commenting on personal matters, there were efforts to reinforce the king's image in the public eye. Public engagements were carefully curated to highlight Charles's compassion, dedication, and modern sensibilities. Photographers were granted more access. Speeches emphasized values of humility and service. Behind the scenes, the communications team worked overtime to ensure that coverage of Nicholas's interview did not define the narrative. One notable strategy was to engage loyal royal commentators. Prominent figures who had long been defenders of the crown were contacted and briefed. Within days, a series of op-eds began appearing in major newspapers. The tone was measured but firm. While avoiding direct attacks on Nicholas, these articles framed his statements as a well-meaning but misguided interpretation of royal duty. One piece, published in the Telegraph, suggested that long-standing relationships often falter when the burden of symbolism outweighs the bond of friendship. Another narrative quietly pushed by palace allies was that Nicholas, though respected, had grown increasingly out of step with the monarchy's efforts to modernize. He was painted as a man nostalgic for a version of the institution that no longer existed, a version that, while dignified, lacked the flexibility needed for the 21st century. This framing was subtle but effective. It allowed defenders of the monarchy to reframe the rupture not as a moral indictment, but as a generational disagreement. Internally, however, the damage was undeniable. Staff who had known Nicholas for decades found themselves questioning what they had missed. Some recalled quiet moments over the years where his faith seemed to waver, a wince during a public blunder, a silence that lingered too long after a controversial decision. But no one expected this. His departure felt like the loss of a stabilizing force, a reminder of the crown's intellectual credibility and moral foundation. There were also concerns about what Nicholas might say next. While his interview was carefully composed and free of sensationalism, the royal household knew that any further revelations, particularly those involving internal discussions or private correspondence, could be catastrophic. Though there were no indications that Nicholas planned to release confidential material, the mere possibility forced the palace to consider options for damage control. Legal advisors were consulted. The monarchy, unlike many institutions, operates in a complex legal gray zone. While there are protocols for handling leaks and breaches of confidence, pursuing legal action against someone like Nicholas would have been unthinkable. Not only would it have drawn more attention to his statements, but it would have contradicted the monarchy's carefully maintained image of dignity and composure. Instead, the palace chose to wait, to observe, to absorb the blow and shift the conversation through other means. Over the following weeks, Charles increased his visibility, particularly in charitable spaces. He made unannounced visits to local communities, emphasized mental health in several addresses, and launched a new environmental initiative that garnered international praise. These actions were not spontaneous. They were designed to remind the public of the king's commitment to service and to slowly drown out the noise of Nicholas's critique. Meanwhile, Nicholas remained silent. He gave no follow-up interviews, refused requests for comment, and continued his work on a forthcoming book. This silence only heightened interest. Speculation grew about what the book might contain, what further insights or criticisms might be shared. But for those within the palace, the silence was a kind of purgatory, a waiting game with no clear end. Privately, some members of the royal household began engaging in their own reflection. While the institution could not acknowledge fault publicly, there were discussions behind closed doors about the validity of some of Nicholas's critiques. Junior staff, in particular, felt emboldened to ask harder questions. Why had the palace remained silent for so long during Diana's struggles? Why had more not been done to prevent the departure of Harry and Meghan? Was the monarchy truly evolving, or merely adapting its exterior? These internal questions did not lead to immediate change. The palace is, by design, a place of gradual movement. But the fact that they were being asked at all signaled a shift. Nicholas's words had penetrated deeper than the press coverage suggested. They had reached the very heart of the institution. In public, however, the palace held the line. No retractions, no clarifications, no acknowledgments. Just a continuation of routine, a return to the familiar rhythm of ceremonial duty. In this, the monarchy hoped to reassert its greatest strength, endurance. By outlasting the moment, by refusing to engage directly, it sought to remind the world that it was bigger than any one man's opinion, no matter how respected. Yet beneath that surface, things had changed. Nicholas Winston SS had not merely spoken out. He had shifted the conversation. He had forced the institution to look inwards, however briefly, and to consider whether its silence, so long a shield, had become a source of its vulnerability. The next section will examine how this public rupture played out in the broader media landscape, and how journalists, commentators, and the public engaged with Nicholas's statements in the weeks and months that followed. In the age of the 24-hour news cycle, few things provoke a more frenzied response than a high-profile figure breaking ranks with the establishment. When Nicholas Winston SS spoke out against King Charles III, it wasn't just a personal reckoning or a philosophical shift, it was media dynamite. Almost overnight, his name dominated headlines across platforms and continents. What made this media moment different was the convergence of legacy, timing, and the impeccable credibility of the man at the center of the storm. The media, always alert for signs of royal drama, lashed onto Nicholas's interview with a hunger rarely seen since the days of Diana's most explosive revelations. The initial coverage focused on shock. How could a man so closely tied to the Churchill lineage, so often seen as an emblem of the monarchy's intellectual arm, turn so publicly on the very institution he had spent his life defending? Newspapers framed it as betrayal. Talk shows asked whether it was bravery. Pundits scrambled to draw connections between Nicholas's critique and past royal crises, tracing a thread from Diana's silent screams to the Sussex's exit, and now, to a voice from within the establishment itself saying enough. Television news segments featured timelines of Nicholas's involvement with the royal family, his known proximity to Charles, and his reputation for discretion. Archival footage from earlier decades resurfaced, showing Nicholas standing beside Charles during official engagements, sitting quietly at major public ceremonies, even offering subtle guidance in off-camera moments captured by observant photographers. These images were now reinterpreted in a new light. What had once been seen as loyalty was now scrutinized as complicity, or perhaps the burden of a man who saw too much for too long and finally chose to speak. Digital platforms amplified the story at an unprecedented scale. On social media, hashtags bearing Nicholas's name trended for days. Threads dissected his interview, pulling out quotes and pairing them with videos of Diana's interviews, statements from Harry and Meghan, and even clips of Charles's more stilted public appearances. For a generation raised on the image of Diana as a wounded figure in a gilded cage, Nicholas's comments served as a long-awaited validation from someone who had once stood firmly on the other side. But not all media responses were favorable. Conservative publications, particularly those aligned with royalist sentiment,